Thief! Seize her at once! Lady Pembroke's accusation cut through the music and chatter of Lord Weatherby's ball, silencing the orchestra mid-note. All eyes turned to Thalia Blackwood, who stood frozen at the entrance of the grand ballroom, her face draining of colour. The diamond necklace, Lady Pembroke's prized possession, dangled from the older woman's fingers as she thrust it toward Thalia. "This was found in Miss Blackwood's reticule by my maid, a family heirloom worth more than this common girl could earn in 20 lifetimes. Thalia stepped forward, her voice steady despite the trembling of her hands. "I never touched your necklace, Lady Pembroke. Someone must have placed it there." Lord Weatherby signalled to his footmen, who quickly positioned themselves on either side of Thalia. The crowd parted, whispers rippling through the assembly like wind through dry leaves. Professor James Blackwood pushed through the throng, his scholarly demeanour crumpling at the sight of his daughter surrounded by accusers. "This is preposterous," he said, placing a protective hand on Thalia's shoulder. "My daughter is incapable of theft," Lady Pembroke sneered. "The daughter of a mere academic attempting to climb the social ladder by any means necessary. How predictable." She turned to face the crowd. "Who among you would now invite the Blackwoods to your homes, knowing what lurks in their character?" From the shadowed corner of the ballroom, the Duke of Ravenscroft observed the scene with detached interest. Lysander Thornfield rarely attended such gatherings, but tonight's events had unexpectedly captured his attention. The young woman held herself with dignity despite the humiliation. Something about her name, Blackwood, stirred a distant memory. 3 days later, Thalia's life had collapsed like a house of cards. Invitations were rescinded. Former friends crossed the street to avoid her. Her father, once respected in academic circles, found his university position suddenly under review. "There's nothing left for us here," Thalia told her father as she packed their meagre belongings in their modest townhouse. The servants had already been dismissed. They could no longer afford them. "Aunt Margaret in Yorkshire might take us in until this scandal passes." Professor Blackwood sat at his desk, staring unseeing at a letter announcing the suspension of his position. To think one woman's malice could destroy 30 years of scholarly reputation. "Lady Pembroke has wanted me gone since I refused her son's advances last season," Thalia said, folding a simple muslin dress. "She called me presumptuous for believing a professor's daughter could reject a baron's son." A knock at the door interrupted them. Their last remaining servant, Martha, entered with a silver tray. "A messenger just delivered this, miss." On the tray lay a sealed letter, the wax impression bearing an unfamiliar crest, a raven perched atop a tower. Thalia broke the seal, her eyes widening as she read. "What is it?" her father asked, noticing her expression. "An invitation from the Duke of Ravenscroft. He requests my presence at his London residence tomorrow morning." Professor Blackwood frowned. "The Duke of Ravenscroft? I've never heard you mention him before." "I've never met him," Thalia said, scanning the letter again. "He writes that he has a proposition that may resolve my current difficulties." "It could be a trap," her father warned. "Your reputation is already in tatters. Meeting unchaperoned with a nobleman." "What reputation remains to protect?" Thalia asked bitterly. "Besides, the Duke rarely appears in society. He's known to be reclusive and cold. What interest could he possibly have in me?" The following morning, Thalia stood before the imposing doors of Ravenscroft House in Mayfair. The butler who admitted her led her through marble hallways to a study where a tall figure stood with his back to her, gazing out a window. "Miss Blackwood," he said without turning, "thank you for accepting my invitation." When he finally faced her, Thalia was struck by his appearance. The Duke of Ravenscroft was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30, with sharp features and penetrating grey eyes that seemed to evaluate her worth in seconds. "You're curious why I've summoned you," he continued, gesturing for her to sit. "Let me be direct. I've observed your recent misfortune with interest. I believe Lady Pembroke's accusation was false, orchestrated to remove you from society." Thalia's surprise must have shown on her face, for the Duke's mouth curved slightly. Not quite a smile. "I have a proposition for you, Miss Blackwood, one that would restore your position and secure your father's future." He paused, studying her reaction. "I propose marriage." Thalia nearly laughed, certain this was an elaborate jest. "Marriage? To you?" "We're strangers, Your Grace." "Precisely why it would suit us both," he replied coolly. "I require a duchess for reasons of my own. You require salvation from social ruin. This arrangement would be conducted with the utmost discretion and minimal interference in each other's lives." "Why me? There must be dozens of suitable young ladies eager to become a duchess." The Duke's expression remained unreadable. I have my reasons, some of which you needn't know. Accept or decline, Miss Blackwood, but understand this. My offer will not be repeated, and your alternatives appear limited. Thalia stood, anger momentarily eclipsing her desperation. Is this how you conduct all your business, Your Grace? Through intimidation? This is not intimidation, Miss Blackwood. This is opportunity disguised as necessity. He handed her a sealed document. My terms. Review them and send your answer by nightfall. As Thalia left Ravencroft House, the document felt impossibly heavy in her hands. Whatever the Duke's mysterious motives, she knew one thing with certainty. Her life had just become considerably more complicated. The terms in the Duke's document haunted Thalia as she walked through London's crowded streets. His conditions were precise and cold. A marriage conducted in absolute secrecy, after which she would relocate to his remote estate in Northumberland. Her father would receive a generous annual stipend and a cottage on the estate grounds. In return, she must agree never to question his past, never enter the west wing of Ravenmoor Hall, and maintain the appearance of a proper duchess when required. It was nearly sunset when Thalia entered their half-emptied townhouse. Her father lay asleep in his armchair, a letter from the university clutched in his hand. New lines had appeared on his face since the scandal, and his breathing sounded labored. The physician had warned that another shock might prove too much for his weakened heart. By lamplight, Thalia composed her response to the Duke. Her hand trembled as she wrote her acceptance. The Duke's carriage arrived at dawn. No time for goodbyes or explanations to neighbors. The Duke had arranged everything with precision. Professor Blackwood would follow in a separate carriage the next day, once the marriage was complete. At a small chapel on the outskirts of London, Thalia found the Duke waiting with only a clergyman and his solicitor present. Lysander Thornfield looked even more imposing in the grey morning light, his tall figure silhouetted against the chapel's stained glass windows. His expression revealed nothing as she approached in her simplest blue dress, hardly appropriate for a wedding, but there had been no time for preparations. "You came," he said, the words neither pleased nor disappointed. "I had little choice, Your Grace." "Lysander," he corrected. "If we're to be married, you should use my given name, at least in private." The ceremony was brief, the words echoing hollowly in the empty chapel. When the clergyman pronounced them husband and wife, the Duke, Lysander, took her hand and slipped a gold band onto her finger. The ring was beautiful, but clearly antique, adorned with tiny ravens, similar to his family crest. "It belonged to my grandmother," he explained, noticing her inspection. "The marriage contract calls for family heirlooms to pass to the Duchess." The solicitor presented the marriage contract for her signature. As she read through it one final time, a particular clause caught her attention. In the event of the Duke's death, Thalia would inherit 1/3 of his considerable fortune, regardless of the duration of their marriage. "This seems generous," she remarked, pointing to the provision. "It's insurance," Lysander replied cryptically, "for both of us." After signing, they departed in separate carriages, Lysander to attend to business matters, Thalia to return home and prepare for their journey north the following day. The whirlwind arrangement left her dizzy with uncertainty. That night, a sealed note arrived from her new husband, containing a bank draft for her father and instructions for their departure. As she packed the last of her possessions, a knock at the door startled her. When she opened it, Lady Pembroke's son, Bartholomew, stumbled forward, clearly intoxicated. "Is it true?" he demanded, his words slurring. "You're to marry Ravencroft, after rejecting me?" Thalia attempted to close the door, but his foot blocked it. "Please leave, Mr. Pembroke. It's inappropriate for you to be here." "Inappropriate?" He laughed bitterly. "Mother said you were a schemer, but this exceeds even her imagination. How did you ensnare Ravencroft? The man's half mad, you know. Keeps to himself because of what happened to his first what?" Thalia asked, despite herself. Bartholomew's expression turned nasty. "You don't know. Perhaps you should ask about Isolde before you bind yourself to him. Ask why no one speaks her name in polite society." Before Thalia could question him further, the clip of approaching hooves announced a carriage. Bartholomew retreated hastily into the shadows. The carriage door opened to reveal Lysander, his features sharp with anger. "Get in," he ordered. "We leave tonight." Once they were moving, he studied her with those penetrating grey eyes. "Did he tell you anything?" "Who?" "Don't play ignorant. Pembroke's son." "What did he say?" Thalia hesitated, then decided on honesty. "He mentioned someone named Isolde. He implied there was something I should know." The muscle in Lysander's jaw tightened. "And this doesn't change your decision, should it? Most women would be curious." Most would demand answers before continuing. I agreed to your terms, Thalia said. No questions about your past. Though I admit it's difficult not to wonder who would spread rumors about you that would reach someone like Bartholomew Pembroke. Lysander looked out the window at the passing London streets. Gossip spreads like plague in society. It infects even the undeserving. He turned back to her. Remember our agreement. Curiosity has destroyed many before you. They travelled through the night, stopping only to change horses. By morning, London was far behind them, and Thalia watched the landscape transform from crowded towns to rolling countryside. Lysander remained largely silent, occasionally consulting papers from his leather portfolio. On the second day of travel, they stopped at an elegant but remote inn. The innkeeper greeted Lysander with obvious recognition and nervous deference. Your usual rooms are prepared, Your Grace. We'll need only one tonight, Lysander replied, glancing at Thalia. The Duchess and I will dine privately. The innkeeper's eyes widened at the word Duchess, but he recovered quickly. Of course, Your Grace, right away. In their private dining room, Thalia finally broke the silence that had stretched between them for hours. How often do you travel this route? Whenever necessary, he answered, revealing nothing. And is there a particular reason we left London so abruptly? Lysander set down his wineglass. Pembroke's visit concerned me. His mother is dangerous. She destroyed your reputation with remarkable efficiency. I wouldn't put it past her to attempt something more drastic to prevent our marriage. Why would Lady Pembroke care whom you marry? Her family has angled for a connection to mine for generations. When I showed interest in you instead, he shrugged. Some people don't accept rejection gracefully. After dinner, the awkwardness of their situation became apparent. One room, one bed. Lysander solved the problem by retrieving papers from his case and settling into a chair near the fireplace. Sleep, he said, gesturing to the bed. I have work to complete. Thalia hesitated. This is our wedding night. This is a marriage of convenience, Thalia, nothing more. His tone softened slightly. I won't impose on you that way. Not tonight, not ever, unless you wish it. Relief mingled with an unexpected twinge of disappointment as Thalia prepared for bed. As she drifted towards sleep, she heard Lysander murmuring something that sounded like a name. Whether it was hers or Isolde's, she couldn't be certain. By dawn, they were travelling again. With each mile northward, Thalia felt London, and her former life, receding like a distant shore. What awaited her at Ravenmore Hall remained a mystery, but one thing was increasingly clear. Lysander Thornfield guarded his secrets as fiercely as a raven protects its nest. Ravenmore Hall emerged from the morning mist like a spectre, its grey stone towers and black slate roof stark against the pale sky. The estate sprawled across acres of moorland, enclosed by a high stone wall with iron gates bearing the raven crest. As their carriage passed through these gates, Thalia noted the ravens perched atop them, real birds watching their arrival with obsidian eyes. They've nested here for generations, Lysander said, following her gaze. Local superstition claims they protect the estate, or guard its secrets, Thalia murmured. A line of servants stood assembled at the entrance, fewer than Thalia expected for such a vast property. At their head stood a severe-looking woman in black, her iron-grey hair pulled tight beneath a cap, her thin lips compressed into a disapproving line. Mrs. Grimshaw, my housekeeper, Lysander explained as he helped Thalia from the carriage. She's managed Ravenmore since before I was born. The housekeeper curtsied stiffly. Your Grace, we weren't expecting your return so soon or with company. Not company, Mrs. Grimshaw. My wife, the new Duchess of Ravencroft. A ripple of surprise passed through the assembled staff. Mrs. Grimshaw's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly before she mastered her expression. Of course, Your Grace. How unexpected. We'll prepare the Duchess's rooms immediately. That won't be necessary, Lysander replied. The Duchess will occupy the blue suite in the east wing. I had it prepared before our departure. This detail surprised Thalia. He had planned for her arrival even before she'd accepted his proposal. The confidence bordered on arrogance, yet it also suggested his offer hadn't been as impulsive as it seemed. Inside, Ravenmore revealed itself as a study in contrasts. Grand architecture, vaulted ceilings, marble floors, imposing staircases existed alongside neglect. Dust covered rarely used furniture, and several wings appeared completely abandoned, their doors firmly closed. The family hasn't entertained properly in years, Lysander explained, noticing her observations. My father preferred isolation after my mother's death. I've maintained his preferences. Mrs. Grimshaw led them through the main hall toward the east wing. As they passed a corridor branching to the west, Thalia noticed the heavy oak doors were secured with an ornate iron lock. The forbidden west wing, she presumed. "Your quarters, Your Grace," Mrs. Grimshaw announced, opening the door to a suite decorated in various shades of blue and silver. Despite the room's obvious grandeur, Thalia couldn't help noticing that it bore no personal touches, no flowers, no welcoming fire in the grate. The bed, though massive and canopied, was made up with linens that smelled of storage. "I'll leave you to settle in," Lysander said. "Dinner is at 8. Mrs. Grimshaw will send someone to guide you to the dining room." Left alone, Thalia explored her new domain. The blue suite comprised a sitting room, bedroom, dressing room, and bathing chamber. Luxurious by any standard, yet somehow unwelcoming. When she tried opening the windows to dispel the musty air, she found them painted shut. A knock at the door revealed a young maid carrying her travel trunk. The girl, no more than 16, kept her eyes downcast as she brought in Thalia's belongings. "What's your name?" Thalia asked. "Ellie, Your Grace," the girl replied, curtsying nervously. "Have you worked at Ravenmore long, Ellie?" 3 years, Your Grace." Ellie hesitated, then added in a rush, "We didn't know His Grace had married again." Thalia caught the slip immediately. "Again?" Ellie's face paled. "I shouldn't have spoken, Your Grace. Mrs. Grimshaw would be most displeased." "You needn't worry. I won't mention our conversation to Mrs. Grimshaw." Thalia moved closer, lowering her voice. "But since you've brought it up, who was she?" "His first wife." "We don't speak of her, Your Grace. It's forbidden." Ellie's hands trembled as she unpacked Thalia's dresses. "But they say her ghost still walks the west wing on moonless nights." Before Thalia could press further, Mrs. Grimshaw appeared at the door, her sharp eyes taking in the scene. "Ellie, I sent you to unpack the Duchess's belongings, not to gossip. Return to your duties at once." Ellie scurried out, leaving Thalia alone with the housekeeper. "Forgive the girl, Your Grace. She's young and prone to fancies," Mrs. Grimshaw said, her tone making it clear where she placed the blame for the exchange. "She mentioned a previous duchess," Thalia said directly. "I wasn't aware my husband had been married before." Mrs. Grimshaw's expression hardened. "His Grace values his privacy. If he hasn't shared certain matters with you, it's not my place to do so." She moved toward the door. "Dinner will be served in 3 hours. I'll send someone to escort you." The remainder of the afternoon passed slowly. Thalia unpacked her meager belongings, which looked pitiful in the massive wardrobes. From her window she observed the grounds, formal gardens long since gone wild, a stone path leading to what appeared to be a family chapel, and beyond that, the rolling moors stretching to the horizon. Her father would arrive tomorrow. At least then she'd have one ally in this strange place. At precisely 7:30, Ellie returned to escort her to dinner. The girl remained silent as they navigated the labyrinthine hallways, but when they reached a portrait gallery leading to the dining room, she paused briefly beside a gap in the row of paintings. A lighter rectangle on the wallpaper indicated where a frame had once hung. "That was her portrait," Ellie whispered. "It disappeared the night after—" She stopped abruptly, eyes widening at something over Thalia's shoulder. "After what?" Lysander's voice came from behind them, causing both women to startle. "You may go, Ellie. I'll escort the Duchess the rest of the way." When the maid had gone, Lysander offered his arm to Thalia. "I see you've been making inquiries." "I've asked nothing that wouldn't naturally occur to anyone in my position," Thalia replied, accepting his arm. "If you wish the servants not to speak of your past, perhaps you should instruct them directly. They know my expectations." His jaw tightened. "What exactly did the girl tell you?" "Only that there was a previous duchess whose portrait once hung here, and that speaking of her is forbidden." Thalia studied his profile as they walked. "She also mentioned a ghost in the west wing, but I assume that's mere superstition." "Servants and their tales," Lysander muttered. "Next they'll claim the ravens speak Latin and predict the future." In the cavernous dining room they sat at opposite ends of a table meant for 20. Footmen served in silence, the only sounds the clink of silver against china and the distant ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall. "Your father arrives tomorrow," Lysander said eventually. "I've had the gardener's cottage prepared for him. It's small but comfortable, with a study suitable for his academic pursuits." "Thank you. He'll appreciate that consideration. I've also arranged for his books and papers to be transported from London." The thoughtfulness of this gesture surprised Thalia. "That's unexpectedly kind." "I'm not entirely the monster you imagine me to be," Lysander replied, a hint of wry humor in his tone. "My reputation for coldness is somewhat exaggerated." "By whom? The servants who fear to speak in your presence, or the society that whispers your name? Lysander set down his wineglass. You agreed not to question my past. I agreed not to enter the West Wing or press you about certain matters. I made no promise to ignore the obvious tension that fills this house. Thalia held his gaze. We may have a marriage of convenience, but I refuse to live in fear of shadows. If there are rules beyond those in our contract, state them plainly now. For a moment, Lysander looked genuinely surprised by her directness. Then, unexpectedly, the corner of his mouth lifted in what might have been the beginning of a smile. You're not what I expected, Thalia Blackwood. He studied her with renewed interest. Very well. Additional rules. Don't wander the grounds after dark. The moors can be treacherous. Don't encourage the servants to gossip. It disturbs the household's routine. And most importantly, if you hear unusual sounds in the night, ignore them. Old houses make strange noises. Is that all? For now. He rose from his chair. I have business to attend to. Feel free to explore the East Wing and the gardens. The library might interest you. Your father mentioned your fondness for books. After he left, Thalia remained at the table contemplating her situation. She had escaped scandal in London, only to find herself in a house filled with whispers and forbidden knowledge. Her husband was an enigma, alternately cold and considerate, guarded yet curiously vulnerable. As she made her way back to her rooms, she took a wrong turn and found herself in an unfamiliar corridor. Moonlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating a door she hadn't noticed before. It stood slightly ajar, revealing the edge of what appeared to be a portrait storage room. Inside, canvases leaned against the walls covered in cloth. Dust motes danced in the beam of moonlight as Thalia slipped into the room. She lifted the edge of one cloth covering, revealing the corner of a gilt frame. As she pulled the covering further, a woman's face emerged from the darkness, beautiful, with sad eyes and pale blonde hair. The portrait bore no identifying plate, but something about the woman's features seemed vaguely familiar, like a face glimpsed in a dream. As Thalia reached to uncover more of the painting, a floorboard creaked behind her. Curiosity, said Mrs. Grimshaw's voice, has consequences in this house, Your Grace. Some doors are locked for good reason. I took a wrong turn, Thalia said, dropping the cloth covering back over the portrait. I was merely trying to find my way back to my rooms. Mrs. Grimshaw's expression remained severe. A wrong turn that led you to open a locked door and uncover hidden items? Most unusual, Your Grace. The door wasn't locked, Thalia countered, refusing to be intimidated. And as the Duchess of Ravencroft, I have every right to explore my new home. Of course, Your Grace. Mrs. Grimshaw's tone suggested otherwise. Allow me to escort you back to your quarters before you take any more wrong turns. As they walked through the corridors, Thalia noted their path for future reference. The storage room was located in the East Wing, technically within her permitted territory, though clearly not intended for her discovery. Who was she? Thalia asked abruptly. The woman in the portrait. Mrs. Grimshaw's steps didn't falter. I couldn't say, Your Grace. The estate contains many portraits of distant relatives. She didn't look like a distant relative, Thalia pressed. She looked recent, contemporary. Perhaps the late Duchess's sister, Mrs. Grimshaw conceded reluctantly. She visited occasionally before the incident. What incident? They had reached Thalia's door. Mrs. Grimshaw's hand rested on the handle, her knuckles white with tension. Ask His Grace if you must know, though I wouldn't recommend it. Left alone again, Thalia's mind raced. Something terrible had happened here, something that had driven Lysander to secrecy and the household to fear. Yet he had sought her out specifically, arranging a marriage that protected her from scandal while entangling her in his own mysterious past. Sleep eluded her. Near midnight, she lit a candle and moved to her sitting room, intending to read. As she passed the window, movement in the gardens caught her eye. A cloaked figure was crossing the lawn toward the small chapel she had noticed earlier. Even from a distance, she recognized Lysander's distinctive gait. Curiosity overrode caution. Wrapping herself in a shawl, Thalia slipped from her rooms and made her way downstairs, following the route Ellie had shown her earlier. The massive front door was locked for the night, but a side entrance near the kitchens yielded to her push. The night air bit through her thin nightgown as she crossed the lawn. The chapel door stood ajar, a faint light flickering within. Thalia approached silently, peering through the gap. Lysander knelt before a small marble monument, head bowed. A single candle illuminated the scene, casting long shadows across the stone floor. From her position, Thalia couldn't see what was engraved on the monument, but she could hear Lysander's voice, low and strained. Another year, he was saying. I've kept my promise. though God knows the cost. A pause. I've found her. A Blackwood, as fate would have it. Whether this ends in redemption or disaster remains to be seen. Thalia stepped back, unnerved by his words, but her heel caught on a loose stone. The resulting noise, slight though it was, caused Lysander to turn sharply. "Who's there?" His voice carried a dangerous edge. Knowing she was caught, Thalia stepped into the doorway. "I saw you from my window." Lysander's expression shifted from anger to something unreadable. "Spying on your husband already?" "Trying to understand him," she corrected. "You speak of me to ghosts, yet reveal nothing to my face." He rose in one fluid movement, extinguishing the candle between his fingers without flinching at the heat. "Return to the house." "Not until you explain what you meant. A Blackwood, as fate would have it. Why is my family name significant to you?" In the darkness, his features were barely discernible, but Thalia sensed his internal struggle. Finally, he said, "The library. Tomorrow morning. Some answers might be found there if you know where to look." He escorted her back to the house in silence. At her door, he paused. "My study contains documents you should never see. The West Wing holds truths you're better off not knowing, but the library, that's neutral territory. Start with the family histories on the east wall, third shelf from the bottom." Before she could respond, he was gone, his footsteps fading down the corridor. Morning brought the arrival of Professor Blackwood. Thalia met her father's carriage with relief, embracing him tightly as he descended. "My dear girl," he said, studying her face. "Are you well?" "This arrangement, it happened so quickly. I've been worried sick." "I'm adjusting," Thalia said carefully, aware of servants hovering nearby. "The Duke has been considerate." Her father glanced at the imposing facade of Ravenmore Hall. An impressive prison, nonetheless. "Hardly a prison," Lysander's voice came from behind them. "You're both free to leave whenever you wish, Professor, though I hope you'll find the accommodations to your liking." Professor Blackwood straightened, facing his new son-in-law with dignity. "Your Grace, I appreciate your generosity, though I remain uncertain about the haste of this union." "Circumstances demanded swift action," Lysander replied. "Your daughter has shown remarkable adaptability, perhaps a family trait." There was something in his tone, a searching quality, that caught Thalia's attention. He was studying her father with unusual intensity. After seeing Professor Blackwood settled in the gardener's cottage, Thalia made her way to the library, as Lysander had suggested. The room was magnificent, 2 stories tall with a gallery around the upper level and windows that actually opened, allowing fresh air to dispel the mustiness that pervaded the rest of the house. The east wall housed leather-bound volumes arranged by subject. Thalia located the family histories without difficulty. Their worn spines suggested frequent consultation. The third shelf from the bottom contained records of notable families of Northumberland, including several volumes dedicated to the Thornfields. As she pulled the first tome free, a folded paper slipped from between its pages and fluttered to the floor. The letter, for that's what it proved to be, was dated 1792, nearly 50 years earlier. "My dearest Catherine, I write in haste and great distress. Your brother has discovered our correspondence and confronted me with accusations I cannot deny. The feud between our families makes our attachment impossible, yet I cannot regret a single moment spent in your company. Thornfield threatens legal action that would ruin your father's remaining holdings. I have offered the only compromise that might protect both our families, to renounce all claim to you and depart for the Americas immediately. Remember me as I was in the meadow that last summer day, not as the coward who flees rather than fight a battle that would destroy you. Forever yours, James Blackwood." Thalia read the letter twice, her heart racing. James Blackwood, her grandfather's name. The letter suggested a romance between her grandfather and a Thornfield woman, ended by family opposition. Could this be why Lysander had sought her out specifically? She searched through additional volumes, finding multiple references to land disputes between the Thornfields and Blackwoods dating back generations. The most recent entry mentioned her grandfather's death under mysterious circumstances, following accusations of trespassing on Thornfield property. "I see you found it." Thalia turned to find Lysander leaning against a bookshelf, watching her. She held up the letter. "Did you place this here for me to find?" "No. I merely suspected it might exist." He approached, taking the letter when she offered it. "Your grandfather was James Blackwood?" "Yes. He died before I was born. My father rarely spoke of him." "Because his death brought shame to your family," Lysander said, his voice oddly gentle. He was found dead on Thornfield land, alleged to have been stealing documents from my grandfather's study. The scandal was hushed up, but it followed your father nonetheless. You believe our families have a connection, Thalia said, piecing together the fragments. That's why you sought me out specifically. When I saw your name in the society pages, linked to the theft accusation, it seemed like an echo across time. Another Blackwood, another false charge. Lysander folded the letter carefully. I was curious initially, then intrigued by your dignity in the face of humiliation. So our marriage is what? An experiment? Historical reconciliation? Perhaps redemption, he said quietly, for both our families. The library door opened before Thalia could respond. Mrs. Grimshaw entered, her face tight with barely controlled agitation. Your Grace, a rider has arrived with urgent news. Mr. Orion Blackwood has been seen in the village inquiring about the estate and its new duchess. Lysander's expression darkened instantly. Orion Blackwood, you're certain? The innkeeper's description was quite specific, Your Grace. Lysander turned to Thalia. Does the name mean anything to you? Thalia shook her head. I know of no relation by that name. He claims to be your cousin, Mrs. Grimshaw said, watching Thalia suspiciously, and says he has information of vital importance to share with you. Have the gates secured, Lysander ordered. No visitors admitted without my express permission. To Thalia, he added, it seems your family holds more secrets than even I suspected. As he strode from the room, Thalia caught a glimpse of something she hadn't seen in his expression before. Fear. 3 days passed with Ravenmoor Hall in a state of heightened vigilance. Extra men patrolled the perimeter walls, and the servants moved through the corridors in tense silence. Thalia divided her time between the library, where she continued researching the Blackwood-Thornfield connection, and visiting her father at the gardener's cottage. Professor Blackwood had settled into his new accommodations with surprising ease. The cottage featured a study, filled with his salvaged books, and a small laboratory, where he could continue his work on botanical extracts. I've never asked what precipitated this marriage, he said as they walked through his newly planted herb garden. Your note mentioned only that the Duke had offered a solution to our difficulties. It's complicated, Thalia replied. There appears to be a historical connection between our families. The Blackwoods and Thornfields were enemies for generations. Her father stopped abruptly. Where did you hear this? I found documents in the library. Letters between grandfather and a Thornfield woman named Catherine. Thalia studied her father's face. You knew, didn't you? Professor Blackwood sighed heavily. I knew of the feud, yes. Your grandfather spoke of it occasionally, especially in his later years when his mind began to wander. I dismissed it as the ramblings of a failing memory. What about his death? Lysander said he died on Thornfield property, accused of theft. That's the official account. Her father's voice dropped. My father maintained his innocence until the end. He claimed he was invited to Ravenmoor by someone named Catherine, that he had documents proving the Thornfields had stolen Blackwood land through fraudulent means. And you never pursued these claims. I was young, with a new position at the university, and your mother's health failing. Fighting old battles seemed pointless. He looked toward the main house, its towers stark against the cloudy sky. Now I wonder if I made a terrible mistake. A servant approached before Thalia could respond, announcing that the Duke requested her presence in the main hall immediately. When she arrived, Thalia found Lysander confronting a man she'd never seen before. Tall and lean, with raven black hair and intense blue eyes, the stranger had the unmistakable Blackwood features, the same high cheekbones and determined chin she saw in her father's face and her own reflection. Ah, here she is, the man said, his aristocratic accent at odds with his weather-worn appearance. The new Duchess of Ravencroft, my long-lost cousin Thalia. Orion Blackwood, I presume, Thalia said, maintaining her composure despite the tension crackling between the two men. In the flesh, he bowed with exaggerated courtesy. Forgive the unannounced visit, but when I heard a Blackwood had married into the family that destroyed ours, I could hardly stay away. Lysander's jaw tightened. State your business and go. You're not welcome here. Direct as ever, Thornfield. Orion's smile didn't reach his eyes. My business is family, specifically warning my cousin about the trap she's fallen into. There's no trap, Thalia said. I entered this marriage willingly. Did you now? Orion raised an eyebrow. And did your husband explain why his first wife fled this house in terror, or why nobody has seen her in 3 years? Lysander moved so quickly that Thalia barely registered his action before he had Orion pinned against the wall, forearm pressed to his throat. Enough, Thalia's voice cut through the tension. Release him, Lysander. Whatever grievance exists between you, this solves nothing. After a moment's hesitation, Lysander stepped back. Orion straightened his coat, unruffled despite the assault. You should listen to your wife, Thornfield. Violence only confirms what I've come to say. He turned to Thalia. I have rooms at the village inn. When you're ready to hear the truth about your husband and this house, send word. I'll wait 3 days. After Orion's departure, the hall fell silent. Lysander stood rigid, his breathing controlled but heavy. Who is he? Thalia asked. How is he connected to my family? His mother was your father's cousin, distantly related, but a Blackwood nonetheless. Lysander moved to the window, watching as Orion rode through the gates. He's a fortune hunter who's squandered his inheritance and now seeks to profit from old grievances. He mentioned your first wife. Lysander's shoulders tensed visibly. Of course he did. Is it true? Were you married before? Yes. The admission came reluctantly, briefly. What happened to her? Lysander turned, his expression hardened into a mask. This doesn't concern you. It concerns me greatly if I've married a man whose previous wife fled in terror, or worse. Thalia stood her ground. I agreed not to question your past, but when strangers arrive making accusations, I deserve answers. For a moment, Thalia thought he might refuse again. Then something in his posture shifted. Not here, he said quietly. Meet me in the library at midnight. The servants retire early. We'll have privacy. The hours until midnight stretched endlessly. Thalia attempted to focus on a book, then tried needlework, but her mind kept returning to Orion's accusations and Lysander's reaction. When the clock finally struck 12, she made her way to the library, finding Lysander already there, a glass of brandy in his hand. 5 years ago, he began without preamble, I married Isolde Blackwood, Orion's sister. The revelation struck Thalia like a physical blow. His sister? The marriage was arranged to end the feud between our families, a peace treaty sealed with vows. Lysander took a long swallow of brandy. It was a disaster from the beginning. Isolde hated Ravenmoor, hated me. She began having episodes of hysteria, claiming the house was haunted, that the servants were poisoning her. What happened to her? On our wedding night, I found her in my study with a knife. She said the voices told her to kill me, that it was the only way to break the curse. His voice remained steady, but Thalia saw his knuckles whiten around the glass. I disarmed her, but the incident confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. Her mind was unstable. And then, her episodes worsened. One night, she set fire to the West Wing, nearly killing herself and 3 servants. After that, there was no choice but to have her committed to Blackthorn Asylum for treatment. She's still there? Thalia asked, struggling to absorb this information. Yes. Her condition hasn't improved. Lysander set down his empty glass. The West Wing remains damaged from the fire. That's why it's sealed off, not to hide some Gothic secret, but because it's structurally unsound. Thalia processed his story, searching for inconsistencies. Why keep this secret? Tragic as it is, mental instability isn't uncommon. The scandal would have ruined both families. Orion agreed to maintain the fiction that Isolde had traveled abroad for her health, while I provided for her care. Lysander's mouth twisted bitterly. Apparently, he's reconsidered our arrangement. That doesn't explain why you sought me out. Why marry another Blackwood after such an experience? Lysander moved to the fireplace, bracing one hand against the mantel. The feud between our families has caused enough damage. I thought, perhaps with a different Blackwood, one untainted by knowledge of the past, there might be a chance to start anew. You still haven't answered my question, Thalia pressed. Why me specifically? Because you reminded me of someone, he admitted reluctantly. Catherine Thornfield, my great-aunt who loved your grandfather. She had the same courage I saw in you that night at Lord Weatherby's ball. The comparison surprised Thalia. You were there, at the ball. In the shadows, yes. I'd gone to observe Lady Pembroke's son, with whom I had business dealings. Instead, I witnessed your humiliation and your dignity in the face of it. He turned to face her directly. When I learned your name was Blackwood, it seemed like fate offering a second chance. Or revenge, Thalia suggested. Perhaps you blamed all Blackwoods for Isolde's actions and saw an opportunity to ruin another. If that were my motive, I need only have left you to Lady Pembroke's machinations. Lysander's voice softened. I don't expect you to believe my intentions were entirely noble. They weren't, but neither were they malicious. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the library in stark white before plunging it back into lamplight. Thunder followed seconds later. A storm approaches, Lysander observed, moving to close the windows. You should return to your rooms. Thalia remained seated. There's more you haven't told me. There's always more, Thalia. Some secrets are better left buried, not when they follow us into the present. She stood, facing him directly. Orion didn't come here merely to warn me. He wants something. Lysander's expression confirmed her suspicion. The Blackwood estate, land that once belonged to your family before it was absorbed into Thornfield Holdings. He believes documents exist, proving the transfer was fraudulent. The same documents my grandfather was allegedly seeking when he died here? Yes. And do they exist? Lysander held her gaze steadily. I don't know. My father kept many secrets, including the true circumstances of your grandfather's death. The storm broke overhead, rain lashing against the windows. A particularly violent gust rattled the glass, and somewhere in the house a door slammed. You should go, Lysander said again, more urgently. Why? What aren't you telling me? Isolde escaped the asylum 3 days ago, he admitted, his voice barely audible above the storm. That's the real reason for the increased security. If Orion is here, she may not be far behind. Thalia felt cold dread settle in her stomach. You believe she would come here? To Ravenmoor? I know she would. She swore to return to finish what she started. Lysander's expression was grim. And now there's a new Duchess of Ravencroft for her to contend with. As if summoned by his words, a scream echoed through the house, high-pitched and terrified. Lysander bolted for the door, Thalia close behind him. They found Ellie collapsed in the corridor, trembling uncontrollably. She's here, the girl gasped. I saw her, by the portrait gallery, all in white with wild eyes. The first Duchess has returned. Stay with her, Lysander ordered, handing Thalia his lantern. I'll search the house. I'm coming with you, Thalia insisted. We don't know what we're facing. Lysander hesitated, then nodded curtly. Stay close. They left Ellie in the care of Mrs. Grimshaw, who had appeared with remarkable speed at the sound of the scream. The housekeeper's face betrayed no surprise at the mention of an intruder, only grim resignation. The portrait gallery was empty when they reached it, but a window at the far end stood open, curtains billowing in the storm wind. Rain had soaked the carpet beneath it, suggesting it had been open for some time. The west wing, Lysander said, his voice tight. If she's here, that's where she'd go. He produced a key from his pocket and unlocked the heavy oak doors that separated the damaged wing from the rest of the house. As they swung open, Thalia was struck by the smell of old smoke and decay. We rebuilt the structural elements, Lysander explained as they entered, but never restored the interiors. No point, when I lived here alone. The corridor beyond was a study in elegant ruin, water-stained wallpaper peeled from the walls. Once fine carpets had rotted into mouldering strips. The roof had been repaired, but water damage from the initial fire had never been addressed. Isolde's rooms were at the end of this hallway, Lysander said, leading the way. She claimed she could hear voices through the walls, spirits of Thornfields past demanding Blackwood blood as payment for trespassing. You believe she was truly mad then? Not faking? I believe something in this house affected her mind. Lysander's tone was carefully neutral. Whether that was inherited instability or something more environmental, I couldn't say. The door to Isolde's former chambers hung from a single hinge. Inside, the destruction was most evident. Scorched walls, melted fixtures, and a blackened four-poster bed frame, its hangings long since consumed by flame. This is where the fire started, Lysander said. She soaked the bed in lamp oil and set it alight while lying upon it. The servants pulled her out, but not before she was badly burned. Why would she try to kill herself? She claimed she wasn't trying to die. She was trying to cleanse the room of evil. Lysander's voice had an odd, distant quality. She said burning was the only way to silence the voices. A soft sound, barely perceptible beneath the storm, came from deeper within the suite. Lysander put a hand on Thalia's arm, motioning for silence as he moved toward an adjoining dressing room. The figure huddled in the corner bore little resemblance to the beautiful woman from the hidden portrait. Her blonde hair had been cropped close to her scalp, an asylum practice Thalia knew. The right side of her face bore shiny burn scars that pulled her features into a perpetual half-grimace. Her white nightgown was filthy and torn, and her feet were bare and bloodied. "Hello, husband," Isolde Blackwood said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I see you've replaced me already." "Isolde," Lysander acknowledged, keeping his distance. "You shouldn't have left Blackthorn. Dr. Morgan says you were improving." A harsh laugh escaped her scarred lips. "Improving? Is that what they told you?" that their treatments were helping? She turned her gaze to Thalia. And who's this? Another Blackwood sacrifice to the Thornfield curse? I'm Thalia, she answered before Lysander could intervene. I didn't know about you when I married him. Of course not. He wouldn't tell you, just as he didn't tell me. Isolde's unburned eye was unnervingly clear and focused. Did he show you the documents yet? The ones that prove everything? There are no documents, Isolde, Lysander said firmly. We've discussed this. What you think you found was a forgery, planted by your brother to justify his claims. Liar! Isolde struggled to her feet. I saw the truth with my own eyes. Your father murdered James Blackwood to keep him silent. Your grandfather stole our lands using falsified deeds. The Thornfields have Blackwood blood on their hands for generations. Orion fed you these delusions, Lysander countered. He wanted control of your inheritance. My brother protected me. He tried to warn me about you, about this house. Isolde's gaze shifted to Thalia. Has she been to the sanitarium yet? The one you visit on the 1st of every month? Thalia looked to Lysander, whose face had gone very still. What sanitarium? She asked. Norwood Grove, Isolde said, a terrible smile twisting her scarred features. Where he keeps his secrets. Ask him who's there, locked away like an animal. Ask him who visits on the 1st of every month without fail. Enough, Isolde, Lysander said, his voice dangerously quiet. No, I don't think it is enough. Isolde took an unsteady step forward. She deserves to know what she's married into. Tell her about Catherine. The name hit Thalia like a physical blow. Catherine, your great-aunt who loved my grandfather. Catherine Thornfield isn't dead, Isolde said. She's at Norwood Grove, where she's been for 50 years, ever since she tried to elope with James Blackwood. Lysander's grandfather caught them and had her committed, rather than allow her to taint the family line by marrying a Blackwood. Is this true? Thalia demanded, turning to Lysander. Before he could answer, a new voice joined the conversation. Every word. Orion Blackwood stood in the doorway, a pistol in his hand. Though she's omitting the most crucial detail, the reason the Thornfields want Blackwood land so desperately. How did you get in here? Lysander asked, his body tense but his voice controlled. Your security is focused on the walls and gates. No one thought to watch the old servants' tunnel that connects the chapel to the house. Orion smiled coldly. An oversight I'm grateful for. What do you want, Orion? Thalia asked. Why come here tonight in this storm? Justice, he replied simply. Retribution for generations of Thornfield crimes against our family, and the papers that prove our claim to the North Valley properties. There are no papers, Lysander insisted. You're lying. Orion raised the pistol. Your father told Isolde otherwise before he died. She saw them. Documents in James Blackwood's hand, describing the location of the coal deposits beneath Blackwood lands. Deposits your grandfather discovered and coveted enough to commit murder for. Coal, Thalia repeated, struggling to follow the rapidly unfolding revelations. The Thornfield fortune isn't built on ancestral lands and wise investments, Orion explained, his eyes never leaving Lysander. It's built on coal mines. Mines that sit beneath what was once Blackwood property. Property stolen through forged deeds after my great-uncle James was murdered in this very house. If such papers existed, why wouldn't my father have used them? Lysander challenged. Why maintain the pretense? Because the original transfer, though based on lies, was legally executed, Orion said. But James Blackwood's testimony would have exposed the fraud, created a scandal that would have destroyed Thornfield's standing in society. That's why your grandfather silenced him. That's why your father continued the cover-up. Thalia's mind raced, connecting fragments of information. And that's why you arranged the marriage to Isolde, to prevent her from pursuing these claims. Lysander's expression revealed nothing, but his silence was confirmation enough. He needed a Blackwood bride to legitimize the transfer, Orion continued. An heir who combined both bloodlines would eliminate any future challenges to the property rights. But I proved less compliant than expected, Isolde said, her voice stronger now. I found the hidden correspondence between James and Catherine. I discovered the truth about the murder. So Lysander had me committed, branded as mad to discredit anything I might reveal. You tried to kill me, Lysander reminded her. You set fire to the West Wing with servants inside. What would you have me do? You could have told the truth, Isolde cried. Admitted what your family did to mine. I didn't know the truth, Lysander insisted, an edge of desperation in his voice. Not until after you were committed. My father confessed everything on his deathbed. The coal deposits, James Blackwood's murder, Catherine's commitment. By then, it was too late to undo what had been done. So you sought out another Blackwood, Thalia said. the final piece falling into place. Me, Lysander turned to her, his composure finally cracking. Yes, when I saw your name, learned of your circumstances, I thought perhaps I could make amends. Unite our families properly this time, without deception. Yet you deceived me from the beginning, Thalia countered. You never mentioned Isolde, never explained why my family name mattered to you. Would you have agreed if I had? Lysander asked. Would any sane woman choose to enter this tangle of old hatreds and family sins? The truth of his words silenced her momentarily. Outside, lightning cracked close by, illuminating the ruined room in harsh white light. Enough talk, Orion said, gesturing with the pistol. The papers, Thornfield. Where are they? I don't have them, Lysander maintained. Whatever my father told Isolde, whatever she thinks she saw, it doesn't exist anymore. He burned everything incriminating before he died. Orion's finger tightened on the trigger. You're lying. He visits the sanitarium, Isolde interjected suddenly. Every month without fail. He brings flowers to Catherine Thornfield, though she rarely recognizes him anymore. Would a man do that if he meant to continue the deception? Would he care for the woman whose life his family destroyed? The question hung in the air, unexpected and piercing. Lysander's expression betrayed genuine surprise at Isolde's observation. I've seen you there, she continued more softly. From my window at Blackthorn, every first of the month like clockwork, even after I tried to kill you, even after everything. Something shifted in the atmosphere of the room, a subtle reordering of alliances and understanding. Thalia looked at her husband with new eyes, seeing beyond the mask of cold control to the burden of inherited guilt he carried. The papers aren't here, Lysander said finally, but I can take you to them. They're at Norwood Grove, hidden in Catherine's room. I've been gathering evidence of my grandfather's crimes for years, building a case for restitution. It's why I visit her, not just out of duty, but to piece together the truth from her occasional moments of lucidity. And you expect us to believe this convenient revelation? Orion scoffed. I expect nothing, Lysander replied, but it's the truth. Ask your sister. She knows what my father was like, what he did to maintain appearances at any cost. Why would I perpetuate that legacy when it's brought nothing but misery to both our families? Orion's resolve seemed to waver. He looked to Isolde, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. Lower the gun, Orion, Thalia said. Violence has solved nothing between our families for generations. Perhaps it's time to try another approach. The tension stretched to breaking point. Then, slowly, Orion lowered the pistol. If you're lying, he warned Lysander, I'll finish what Isolde started. If I'm lying, Lysander replied, you won't need to. Thalia will despise me enough for both of you. As the storm raged outside and old hatreds hung in the balance within, Thalia realized that the most dangerous revelation wasn't about coal deposits or murder or falsified deeds. It was the possibility that beneath his guarded exterior, Lysander Thornfield might actually be attempting, in his own flawed way, to right his family's wrongs. And that, somehow, seemed the most unsettling discovery of all. Chapter 7. Flames of Revelation. Dawn broke with smoke-gray clouds and persistent rain. The storm had passed, but its aftermath lingered in fallen branches and saturated ground. Inside Ravenmoor Hall, an uneasy truce held between longtime enemies as preparations were made for the journey to Norwood Grove Sanitarium. Professor Blackwood insisted on accompanying them after learning of the night's revelations. His face had aged a decade when Thalia explained what they had discovered about his father's death. I always suspected there was more to the story, he said as they waited in the entrance hall. Father was no thief. He was meticulous about documentation and property rights, but I lacked the courage to pursue the truth. You protected your family, Thalia reassured him, as he would have wanted. At what cost? His voice was bitter. Justice denied, our family name tarnished, ancestral lands lost. Perhaps not lost forever, Lysander said, joining them. He wore a dark traveling coat, his face drawn from a sleepless night. If the documents confirm what I believe they will, restitution can be made. Professor Blackwood studied him with measured distrust. Why this change of heart, Your Grace? Your family has protected these secrets for generations. My father's deathbed confession changed everything, Lysander replied. He revealed the truth too late for me to prevent Isolde's suffering, but not too late to begin making amends. Orion and Isolde emerged from the east wing, where they had been housed overnight under watchful eyes. Isolde had been bathed and dressed in a simple gown borrowed from Thalia. With her hair combed and face clean, she appeared more lucid, though the burn scars remained a vivid reminder of her past torment. 2 carriages, Lysander announced. Professor Blackwood will travel with Thalia and myself. Orion and Isolde will follow with 2 of my men. Separating us already? Orion challenged. A precaution, Lysander replied evenly, for all our sakes. The journey to Norwood Grove took 3 hours through rain-soaked countryside. Inside the carriage, conversation was sparse, each person lost in private thoughts. Thalia observed her husband's profile as he gazed out at the passing landscape. The rigid control that had defined him since their first meeting showed signs of fracturing, revealing glimpses of the burden he carried. Norwood Grove presented a genteel facade that belied its purpose. Set amid manicured gardens and mature oak trees, the Georgian mansion resembled a country estate more than an asylum. Only the discreet iron bars on the lower windows and the high perimeter wall suggested its true function. Dr. Hayes, the director, greeted Lysander with obvious familiarity. Your Grace, we weren't expecting you until next week, and you've brought guests. His smile faltered as he recognized Isolde among the party. Mrs. Thornfield, we've been terribly concerned about your welfare. I imagine you have, Isolde replied coldly, considering the substantial fee my husband pays for my containment. Treatment, Dr. Hayes corrected automatically. Your Grace, perhaps we should speak privately. That won't be necessary, Lysander said firmly. We're here to see Catherine Thornfield. The director's professional demeanor slipped momentarily. Miss Thornfield is having one of her difficult days. I'm not sure visitors would be advisable. Nevertheless, we will see her. Lysander's tone left no room for argument. All of us. Catherine Thornfield's rooms occupied the top floor of the asylum's east wing, comfortable accommodations with views of the garden and countryside beyond. The elderly woman sat in a wheelchair by the window, her white hair arranged neatly, her thin hands folded in her lap. She gave no indication she was aware of their entrance. Aunt Catherine, Lysander said gently, kneeling beside her chair. I've brought visitors today. No response. The old woman continued staring out at the rain-washed gardens. She rarely speaks anymore, Dr. Hayes explained from the doorway. Her lucid periods have become increasingly rare over the past year. Professor Blackwood approached cautiously, studying Catherine's face. She would have been beautiful once, he murmured. Like the woman my father described in his journals. At the sound of his voice, Catherine turned slightly. Something flickered in her faded blue eyes, a spark of recognition or awareness. James? The name emerged as a raspy whisper. Professor Blackwood started. No, Miss Thornfield, I'm his son, Philip. Catherine stared at him intently. Her hand trembled as she lifted it toward his face. You have his eyes, she said, with unexpected clarity. He always said our children would have those eyes. The moment hung suspended in time, a fragile connection across decades of separation and loss. Then Catherine's attention drifted again, her gaze returning to the window. Where are the documents, Aunt Catherine? Lysander asked quietly. The papers from James Blackwood that you kept hidden all these years. For a moment, it seemed she hadn't heard. Then her hand moved to the arm of her wheelchair, fingers tracing a pattern on the wooden surface. Ravens guard the secrets, she murmured, in plain sight, where blind eyes pass daily. Lysander examined the chair carefully, running his fingers along the carved armrest, where ravens formed part of the decorative pattern. After a moment, he pressed a specific point in the carving. A small compartment clicked open in the arm, revealing a hollowed space within. From this hiding place, Lysander withdrew a packet of yellowed papers tied with faded ribbon. She kept them where she could always touch them, he said, even when her mind wandered. The documents, when carefully unfolded, confirmed everything Isolde had claimed. Maps of the Blackwood property with coal seam locations clearly marked, letters between James Blackwood and mining engineers discussing extraction possibilities, and, most damning of all, the original property deed with notations in the elder Thornfield's hand detailing how the forgery should be executed. My father never saw these, Lysander said, handing the papers to Professor Blackwood. He knew only what his father had confessed, that James Blackwood was murdered to protect the family's claim to the coal beneath Blackwood land. These prove criminal fraud, Professor Blackwood said, scanning the documents with academic precision. The original property transfer would be invalidated under law, which is why I've spent the past year preparing for this moment, Lysander revealed. My solicitors have drawn up papers transferring the disputed lands and a share of the mining proceeds to the remaining Blackwood heirs. Reparations cannot undo the past, but they can secure your family's future. Orion's expression mixed suspicion with grudging respect. You've planned this all along? Since my father's confession, yes. Finding Thalia accelerated my timeline. Lysander looked at his wife, uncertainty in his gaze. I should have told you everything from the beginning. I convinced myself that protecting you from these ugly truths was kindness, not cowardice. You weren't protecting me, Thalia said quietly. You were protecting yourself from judgment, from rejection, from the possibility that I might walk away once I knew the truth. Yes, he admitted simply. Though my intentions toward you were never malicious, my methods were unforgivably manipulative. The raw honesty of his confession caught Thalia off guard. Before she could respond, the door to Catherine's room burst open. Mrs. Grimshaw stood in the doorway, her usually composed features contorted with rage. You fool, she hissed at Lysander. Your father went to his grave protecting these secrets, and you would expose them to strangers. Mrs. Grimshaw, Lysander said, rising to face her. How did you think I wouldn't follow when you set off with these Blackwoods? That I wouldn't recognize the threat to everything your family built? The housekeeper's hand emerged from her cloak, revealing a small revolver. I served your father faithfully for 30 years. I won't allow his son to destroy his legacy. By defending fraud and murder, Thalia challenged, stepping forward despite Lysander's warning gesture. What kind of legacy is built on such foundations? Mrs. Grimshaw's gaze hardened. A powerful one, a lasting one, more than a common professor's daughter could understand. She turned the gun toward Catherine. She should have died years ago. The madwoman who started all this trouble with her inappropriate attachment to a Blackwood. Lower the weapon, Mrs. Grimshaw, Lysander ordered, his voice level despite the tension evident in his posture. Whatever loyalty you bore my father doesn't extend to murder, doesn't it? The housekeeper's laugh held no humor. Who do you think ensured James Blackwood never left Ravenmoor alive? Who procured the poison that made his death appear natural? Your grandfather lacked the stomach for direct action, but I had no such weakness. The confession struck the room like a thunderbolt. Professor Blackwood made a strangled sound of distress, while Orion moved protectively in front of Isolde. All these years, Lysander said softly, you knew everything. Someone had to protect the family's interests when sentiment clouded judgment. Mrs. Grimshaw's finger tightened on the trigger. As I'm doing now. Everything happened in an instant. Mrs. Grimshaw aimed at Catherine just as Isolde lunged forward, knocking the wheelchair aside. The gun discharged with a deafening crack in the confined space. Lysander threw himself toward the housekeeper as she fired again. Thalia saw Lysander stagger, his hand going to his shoulder where blood began to stain his coat. White-hot fury surged through her as she grabbed a heavy crystal vase from a nearby table and brought it down on Mrs. Grimshaw's arm. The gun clattered to the floor as the housekeeper cried out in pain. Orion retrieved the weapon, training it on Mrs. Grimshaw as Dr. Hayes rushed to Lysander's side. The bullet passed through, the doctor announced after a quick examination. Painful but not life-threatening. In the chaos, no one immediately noticed Catherine Thornfield. The elderly woman had risen from her fallen wheelchair and stood with surprising steadiness, gazing at the scene before her with newfound clarity. I remember now, she said, her voice stronger than before. I remember everything. All attention turned to her as she continued. Eudora Grimshaw, you brought me tea the night James and I planned to leave. Tea that made me confused, unable to think clearly. You told my brother I was having a nervous episode, that I'd threatened to elope with James Blackwood. That's how it began. Mrs. Grimshaw's face contorted with hatred. You would have ruined everything, given Blackwood access to lands worth millions. I protected your family's inheritance from your foolishness. You sentenced me to 50 years of living death, Catherine replied with quiet dignity, and murdered the only man I ever loved. Before anyone could react, Mrs. Grimshaw broke free from Orion's grasp and lunged for the fireplace, seizing an iron poker. She swung it wildly, knocking a kerosene lamp from its stand. The lamp shattered against the wall, flames erupting instantly as the fuel spread across the wooden floor. If I burn, these secrets burn with me, Mrs. Grimshaw cried, using the distraction to rush from the room. Fire spread with terrifying speed, consuming the aged wallpaper and dry wooden floorboards. Dr. Hayes shouted for orderlies as he helped Catherine toward the door. Orion guided Isolde through the thickening smoke, while Professor Blackwood gathered the precious documents. Thalia moved to Lysander's side, supporting him as they followed the others into the hallway. Already the fire had spread to adjacent rooms, smoke billowing through the corridor. "The other patients," Lysander gasped, clutching his wounded shoulder. "We have to ensure they're evacuated." Shouts and alarms echoed through the building. A staff rushed to move patients from the endangered wing. Outside, rain continued to fall, hissing where it met the flames now visible through the upper windows. By the time they reached the safety of the front lawn, half the asylum's east wing was engulfed. Patients huddled under blankets as doctors and nurses conducted head counts. Water brigades had formed, passing buckets from the well to the burning structure, though their efforts seemed futile against the growing inferno. "Where's Mrs. Grimshaw?" Thalia asked suddenly, scanning the gathered crowd. No one had seen the housekeeper emerge from the building. As they watched, a section of the upper floor collapsed inward with a thunderous crash, sending sparks and burning debris spiraling into the rainy sky. "She chose her fate," Lysander said grimly, wincing as Dr. Hayes bandaged his shoulder, "just as my grandfather chose his and my father after him." "And what fate have you chosen?" Thalia asked, studying her husband's ash-streaked face. Lysander met her gaze directly. "Atonement, if it's not too late. Truth, however painful, and hope that some bridges once burned might still be rebuilt from their ashes." In the distance, Catherine Thornfield sat beneath an umbrella held by an attendant. Her face lifted to the rain, expression serene despite the destruction before her. Free at last from secrets that had imprisoned her far more effectively than any asylum walls. As Thalia watched the flames consume decades of hidden truths, she wondered whether anything could emerge from such complete devastation, or whether, like the east wing of Norwood Grove, some damages proved beyond repair. 3 weeks after the fire at Norwood Grove, London society buzzed with rumours. The mysterious Duke of Ravenscroft had emerged from seclusion, his arm in a sling, and a new duchess at his side. More shocking still were whispers of coal mine shares suddenly transferred to Professor Philip Blackwood, and substantial donations made to improve conditions at Blackthorn Asylum, where the Duke's first wife had reportedly been a patient. Lady Pembroke observed these developments with mounting unease. The scandal she had orchestrated against Thalia Blackwood had backfired spectacularly, transforming a ruined academic's daughter into one of the wealthiest duchesses in England. Worse, an investigation into her son's gambling debts had revealed connections to forgery and fraud that threatened the Pembroke standing in society. When an invitation arrived for Lord Wetherby's spring ball, the same event where Thalia's disgrace had begun, Lady Pembroke's hand trembled as she broke the seal. The note inside was brief but devastating. Her presence was requested in the library 1 hour before the ball commenced. The signature belonged to the Duke of Ravenscroft. "You needn't look so terrified, Lady Pembroke," Lysander remarked when she entered Lord Wetherby's library that evening. "I merely wish to conclude our business privately, rather than create another public spectacle." The older woman straightened her spine, clinging to dignity despite her fear. "I don't know what you mean, Your Grace. We have no business together, don't we?" Lysander removed a folder from his coat. "These documents suggest otherwise. Bank drafts connecting you to the theft of your own necklace. Correspondence with the maid who planted it in Miss Blackwood's reticule. Most damning of all, your arrangement with Mrs. Grimshaw to report on my movements in London last season." Lady Pembroke paled. "How did you—" "Mrs. Grimshaw kept meticulous records," Lysander continued. "A useful trait in a housekeeper, less useful in a co-conspirator." "What do you want?" Lady Pembroke asked, her composure cracking. "Your immediate departure from London. A permanent retirement to your country estate would benefit your health, I think." Lysander's voice was pleasant, but left no room for negotiation. "In return, these documents remain private." "You've destroyed me regardless," she hissed. "Everyone will know I've been banished." "Perhaps, but there's a significant difference between social inconvenience and criminal prosecution." Lysander moved toward the door. "You have until tomorrow morning to make your arrangements. Good evening, Lady Pembroke." As the disgraced woman slipped from the library, Thalia emerged from an adjacent sitting room where she had observed the exchange. "That was merciful," she noted, "more than she deserved." "Vengeance has poisoned enough lives in this saga," Lysander replied. "Besides, her absence from society is punishment enough for a woman whose entire existence revolves around its approval." Thalia studied her husband in the lamplight. The past weeks had altered him, softening the hard edges of his reserve without diminishing his strength. His wounded shoulder had healed enough to discard the sling, though he still moved with care. "Are you certain about tonight?" she asked. "We could have remained at Ravenmoor until everything was settled. Hiding serves no purpose now." The truth, however incomplete, has been acknowledged. Lysander offered his arm. Besides, I believe my wife deserves to show London society exactly what they nearly lost through baseless accusations. Thalia had chosen her gown with care, midnight blue silk that complemented the sapphires Lysander had presented to her the previous week. Around her neck hung the raven pendant that had once belonged to Catherine Thornfield, given as a gesture of reconciliation and acceptance. Lord Wetherby's ballroom fell silent as they entered, the orchestra faltering momentarily before resuming with forced enthusiasm. Whispers rippled through the assembly as the Duke and Duchess of Ravenscroft moved among the guests, acknowledging acquaintances with calm dignity. Professor Blackwood joined them, his academic status newly enhanced by both his connection to the Duke and the substantial funds now available for his research. He had chosen to remain in London, rather than return to the gardener's cottage at Ravenmoor, establishing a laboratory where he could continue his work while maintaining independence from his daughter's marriage. Lady Pembroke departed in quite a hurry, he observed quietly. I passed her carriage on my way here, loaded with trunks as though for a significant journey. A change of scene was recommended for her health, Lysander replied, with deliberate vagueness. Country air can be most restorative. As the evening progressed, Thalia found herself approached by former friends who had abandoned her after the theft accusation. Their apologies ranged from sincere to transparently self-serving, but she accepted each with the same measured grace. "You're more forgiving than I would be," remarked a familiar voice at her elbow. Orion Blackwood stood beside her, surprisingly elegant in formal evening wear. Though perhaps that's the luxury of victory. Not victory, Thalia corrected. Resolution, there's a difference. So you keep insisting. Orion glanced across the room to where Lysander was engaged in conversation with Lord Wetherby. I still don't entirely trust him, you know. I don't expect you to, Thalia replied. But the documents have been verified, the property transfers executed, and your sister is receiving proper care at a private clinic in Switzerland. He's honored every promise. Orion nodded reluctantly. Isolde's latest letter mentioned improvement. The new doctors believe her condition was exacerbated by the treatments at Blackthorn, not caused by them. That's encouraging news. Indeed. Orion hesitated, then added, I'm leaving for America next week. With my portion of the settlement, I can establish myself properly there, without the shadow of family history. Will you write? Thalia asked, genuinely curious about his future. Occasionally, perhaps. Though I suspect our paths will rarely cross again. Orion's expression held a hint of regret. Some chapters are better concluded decisively, wouldn't you agree? The question lingered as he moved away, leaving Thalia to consider the many conclusions and beginnings that had marked recent weeks. Catherine Thornfield had been moved to a comfortable cottage on the Ravenmoor estate, where she spent her days in the gardens, occasionally lucid enough to share stories of her youth with Professor Blackwood. The West Wing reconstruction had begun, with plans to transform it into a research library dedicated to improving asylum conditions and mental health treatments. Most significant was the change within Ravenmoor itself. Windows once painted shut, now opened freely. Rooms long closed had been aired and furnished. Even Mrs. Grimshaw's replacement, a cheerful woman from the village, had remarked on the difference in atmosphere since her arrival. As the evening progressed toward midnight, Lysander found Thalia on the terrace, seeking momentary respite from the crowded ballroom. Second thoughts? He asked, joining her at the stone balustrade. Reflections, she corrected, on how quickly life can transform, for better or worse. And your current assessment? Better or worse? Thalia considered the question seriously. Different, she decided. Neither the disaster I feared, nor the simple solution I hoped for. Something more complex and potentially more valuable. An accurate summary of our situation, Lysander agreed, though you haven't answered whether you regret our arrangement. Would it matter if I did? Thalia asked. The contracts are signed, the property transferred, the scandal addressed. It would matter to me, Lysander said simply. The directness of his response surprised her. Why? Because somewhere between our calculated arrangement and tonight, my motivations changed. Lysander turned to face her fully. I began with guilt and a desire for historical reconciliation. I continued out of obligation and honor. But now, Thalia prompted when he hesitated. Now I find myself hoping our marriage might evolve beyond its pragmatic origins. His voice had softened, vulnerability evident beneath his customary control. If you're willing to consider such a possibility, the moment hung between them, a crossroads as significant as any they had faced. Thalia studied her husband's face, noting the uncertainty in his eyes that no amount of ducal authority could disguise. "I married a stranger for protection and security," she said finally, "but the man standing before me now is no longer a stranger. He's someone whose actions, however flawed, reveal character worth exploring further." Relief touched Lysander's features. "That's more than I dared hope for." "Hope," Thalia echoed. "An unexpected foundation for a relationship that began in secrets and necessity, yet perhaps more sustainable than either." Lysander offered his hand. "Shall we return to the ballroom? I believe they're about to announce the final dance." Thalia placed her hand in his. "Lead on, Your Grace." They re-entered the ballroom as the orchestra began the final waltz of the evening. As they moved across the floor, Thalia was acutely aware of the eyes following them, some curious, some envious, some still suspicious of their rapid rise from scandal to triumph. "They'll gossip regardless," Lysander murmured, reading her thoughts. "Let them. We know the truth." "Not all of it," Thalia reminded him. "Some parts of our story remain private, as they should. Every marriage contains mysteries known only to those within it." The music swelled around them as they completed the final turns of the waltz. When the last notes faded, Lysander retained his hold on her hand. "Ready to return to Ravenmoor?" he asked. "Or would you prefer to remain in London a while longer?" Thalia considered the options. London offered society, entertainment, her father's proximity. Ravenmoor held peace, privacy, and the opportunity to create something new from ancient discord. Ravenmoor, she decided. There's much still to be done there. "Restoration takes time," Lysander agreed. "I wasn't speaking merely of the house," Thalia clarified, "though that too requires attention." They departed Lord Weatherby's ball with quiet dignity, leaving speculation and whispers in their wake. Their carriage passed through London streets toward the townhouse they would occupy for one more night before returning north. "I've been meaning to ask," Thalia said as they traveled. "The ravens at Ravenmoor, is it true they've nested there for generations?" "Yes, though the superstition about their protective powers is merely that. Superstition." Lysander's expression lightened. "Why do you ask?" "I was thinking of studying them, their behavior, nesting patterns, lifespan." Thalia smiled at his surprised look. "My father's scientific curiosity may have influenced me more than I realized." "Ravens mate for life, you know," Lysander offered. "Once paired, they remain together through all seasons." "A compelling attribute," Thalia observed, "though I suspect their relationships like ours are more complex than legend suggests." "Undoubtedly." Lysander's hand found hers in the darkness of the carriage, but perhaps that complexity is what gives value to the bond. As London receded behind them and the future stretched ahead, uncertain but full of possibility, Thalia reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. From false accusation to reluctant bride to something not yet defined but increasingly genuine, the road to Ravenmoor would be neither simple nor perfect. The ghosts of past wrongs could never be fully exorcised. But in the space between calculated arrangement and genuine connection, something unexpected had taken root, a tentative trust that might, with care and patience, blossom into something neither of them had dared imagine when they first exchanged their vows. Not an ending, Thalia decided, as she watched the city lights fade into darkness. Rather, the beginning of a different story altogether, one they would write together, page by careful page.